Hello, and welcome to the 7th session of the Health and Energy Platform of Action webinar series, Transitioning to Clean Cooking. This series aims to facilitate the design of policies that promote the adoption of clean household energy. It features sessions on standards, data for decision-making, interventions, and cross-cutting themes such as gender and climate change, and serves to connect stakeholders from the health, energy, environment sectors. Before we get started, I have 2 housekeeping items that I'd like to bring up. First, if you have questions for the panelists, please submit them through the Q&A function, and we will address those toward the end of the event if we have time. Secondly, if you have registered for networking as part of the Week of Clean Cooking, please be sure to check your messages through the matchmaking platform and schedule your meeting. Today's webinar, Driving Climate Action Through Cooking, will highlight clean household energy as an essential strategy for mitigating climate change, in addition to improving health. Through 2 keynote presentations and a panel discussion by experts and leaders in the field, the event will show the importance of clean cooking, heating, and lighting for achieving the world's climate as well as health goals. With that said, it is my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Shonali Pachari. Dr. Pachari is the leader of the new Transformative Institutional and Social Solutions Research Group in the Energy and Climate and Environment Program at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, or IASA. She also serves on the Science Advisory Panel for the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. Dr. Pachari will be speaking today about the state of science on climate and health benefits of clean household energy. She will also discuss her recent paper, Access to Clean Cooking Services in Energy and Emission Scenarios After COVID-19, and the importance of clean cooking in combating climate change. Dr. Pachari, over to you.
Thank you so much, Donnie, and it's a real pleasure. I want to thank the organizers of this to invite me to present here today. This is, of course, an extremely important topic, one that has been a challenge for much of the world for many years. And we know that even today, 3 billion people globally cook with solid fuels. This results in more than 4 million premature deaths every year. And we know that transitioning to improved cook stoves and cleaner burning fuels like liquid petroleum gas or natural gas or electric cooking even, can positively influence forest resources, global climate, local air quality, indoor air quality, gender equality, human health, and well-being. So in fact, has positive synergies with multiple SDGs. However, there's concern that households might be transitioning from what you might consider a renewable fuel, which is biomass, like firewood, dung, and so on, to something that is not renewable, fossil fuels. And this, of course, has raised the question of the net climate change impact of such a transition. But what's important to remember is, of course, even when biomass is renewably harvested, cooking with biomass and other solid fuels in primitive cook stoves results in incomplete combustion. And what this means is that there's an impact on the climate through emissions of climate-related gases, such as methane, nitrous oxide, carbon monoxide, non-methane volatile organic contaminants, as well as through the emissions of black carbon, which is commonly called soot, a short-lived climate-forcing agent, which is considered a super pollutant because it has significant impacts on global warming, as well as on Arctic and glacial ice melting. So although gas and electric options can significantly reduce household air pollution and the attendant health impacts, they do result in some greenhouse gas emissions through direct fossil fuel combustion in the case of natural gas or LPG, or in the case of electric cooking through the power generation systems that power the electricity supply and which are still largely dependent on fossil fuels today. So even though in some cases biomass is renewably harvested and the incomplete combustion of it results in greenhouse gas emissions, in some instances it's also not renewably harvested And globally, we estimate that about 30% of fuel wood is not harvested renewably, so it's not being replaced. And in this case, of course, there's a lot of variety in terms of the share of non-renewable biomass across the world. And in this case, when it's non-renewably harvested, then of course, it's also resulting in carbon dioxide emissions. Now, most estimates that we see globally suggest that solid fuels for cooking are responsible for about 1.5 to 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But these estimates are highly dependent on the assumptions regarding how much of biomass is renewably harvested and which gases are included in the emissions accounting. So often short-lived climate pollutants like black carbon that are co-emitted are not accounted for in such estimates. And what this means is that actually we kind of underestimate the climate impacts of cooking with dirty fuels. In fact, it is estimated that about half of the total anthropogenic black carbon emissions are produced from burning solid fuels. Thus, clean cooking solutions can have a really big role to play in mitigating actions related to black carbon. In analysis that we've done for India, we've seen that the transition to LPG cooking over the last 2 decades has really reduced pressures on forests and achieved some modest climate benefits. But there are, of course, uncertainties associated with, again, the extent of non-renewable biomass harvesting in India, and depends on very much which gases are included in the emissions accounting. Recent evidence from 40 low and middle income countries also shows that cook stoves programs that use LPG stoves, for instance, that look at a switch to using LPG stoves could yield really big reductions, both in the health impacts and the climate impacts. In other research, we've seen that in sub-Saharan Africa, there could be some climate mitigation potential also from moving to inexpensive, improved efficiency biomass cook stoves, particularly in highly populous nations or in hotspot regions where you have high population growth, such in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The COVID-19 pandemic has really stalled efforts and increased the challenge to achieve universal access to clean cooking. But recovery efforts can really provide us an opportunity for accelerating the transition. New research that we've just undertaken shows that at a global scale, without additional support policies, clean cooking could become unaffordable for about 470 million people by 2030 in a post-pandemic slow recovery scenario. So this is, of course, extremely concerning. We explore clean cooking access scenarios till 2050 under alternative futures. And even under our most optimistic economic growth and inequality reduction future scenario, we find that universal clean cooking access is unlikely to be achieved by 2030 without additional policies. And in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, this may not be achieved even by 2050. We also see, of course, that cooking poverty strongly correlates with income poverty. So our results are very much aligned to results that we've seen from the World Bank on the overall COVID pandemic impact on income poverty, for instance. Now, achieving universal access to clean cooking by 2030 will require really transformative solutions. We need both market-based investment-driven solutions that improve the overall cooking ecosystem, but keeping kind of end users' needs and priorities at the center. We need specially interlinked solutions in 3 areas: political commitment, investments, and knowledge and innovation, with political commitment really being the most important of these. We know that achieving universal access to clean cooking needs to be prioritized urgently. It really is a cross-sectoral development issue. And so that means it requires integrated strategic energy development and planning processes. We know that things like the national determined contributions to address climate change and COVID-19 recovery plans can really have a big role to play in achieving this goal. Pledges to COVID-19 recovery funds, international climate finance really are huge in comparison to the investment needs required to achieve global clean cooking access. So at a global scale, the finance is available, but it's really a question of tapping it to make clean cooking more accessible and affordable in the poorest regions and for the poorest populations. Because cooking is linked to habits and traditions, we also need to be thinking about the fact that one size doesn't fit all in this case. So we really need to be putting in effort for continued monitoring and evaluation so that we can adjust and achieve better results over time. We have new monitoring and tracking frameworks at the global level, such as the World Bank's multi-tier framework. And we've done our own research in this area and come up with an alternative framework that is a simplification of this. And these can really be used to track progress and measure impacts in multiple dimensions, which is what we need. And also at a more granular scale than just national aggregates. We have new and emerging technologies, business models, financing mechanisms, all of these which can enable affordable clean cooking for many low-income households. But it's really tapping into and accelerating such innovations that are required. I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shonali. And I think I heard it so clearly is that it definitely, clean cooking is definitely needs to be part of the climate kind of bucket, that transitioning does lead to benefits in climate, especially with the reductions of black carbon when we look at. And in listening to your scenarios, it is true, we will not make it to clean energy access for all by 2030 without more political commitment, without investments, and without knowledge and innovation. And so that is so important as we go forward and look at those 2030 energy access goals and our climate commitments. Next up, I have Margaret Kim from Gold Standard. She is the CEO of Gold Standard, and she will be discussing today really the role of cooking and clean household energy in addressing climate change through the voluntary carbon market, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and countries' NDCs, among other things. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you very much, Donnie. Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Margaret Kim, CEO of the Gold Standard. We are a nonprofit organization based in Geneva, Switzerland, where we work to achieve an ambitious but simple vision: climate security and sustainable development for all. And it's clear that clean cooking represents a major driver of progress towards our vision. So I really would like to thank and congratulate Clean Cooking Alliance for organizing the first ever week of clean cooking, and also World Health Organization for co-hosting this session. So indeed, these conversations will continue on into next month, where representatives from 197 countries will gather in Glasgow for COP26 to work toward two very important goals. One is to secure global net zero by mid-century, and second, to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. So negotiators are tasked with establishing the framework for climate finance to serve people and nature by securing national public commitments to reach $100 billion target. But even more politically complex is by agreeing to a rule book for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which governs international carbon markets. But we know that the negotiations are a bit stalled. So if carbon market mechanisms are designed with proper incentives and safeguards, it can certainly help catalyze private investment to unleash trillions of dollars required to secure global net zero. And fortunately, some are already gaining momentum despite the lack of consensus on Article 6. And the voluntary carbon market is rapidly accelerating due to companies looking to purchase carbon credits as a way to take responsibility for their unabated carbon emissions, while they pursue the longer term of reaching net zero targets. So a lot of the reports indicate that voluntary carbon market may reach $1 billion for the first time this year. So it's no surprise that financial sector is also increasingly getting involved in this emerging and expanding market opportunity. So in parallel, the broader world of sustainable finance is also presenting new opportunities to fund positive impact for climate and communities around the world, especially with ESG rising on the agenda of many investors. So what does all of this mean for clean cooking? And we heard from Sholani on the challenges we face post-pandemic. And this is why accelerating investment in this sector is ever more important. So we see three key opportunities to help accelerate investment in this sector. The first is to maintain distinction in the voluntary carbon market. So we already heard from Sholani how the transition to clean cooking and household energy can help mitigate the climate emergency. And indeed, the carbon remains the core value carrier in market mechanisms. But we all know that clean cooking and household energy deliver multiple benefits towards the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And fortunately, these additional SDG impacts have risen steadily in importance among buyers of carbon credits. And that's why one avenue we're pursuing at Gold Standard is to more precisely monitor, quantify, and value co-benefits through our user-friendly SDG tools. We also have commissioned a study by environmental economists to assess the economic value delivered for every carbon credit issued or every ton of CO2 mitigated. And for energy efficient cook stoves, this was $267 for every credit. And for household biogas, this was $465 economic value created per credit. So this return on impact investment in terms of improved health, gender equality, poverty reduction, and more is especially important for companies that have other sustainability commitments or SDG priorities. So by purchasing carbon credits, they can not only take responsibility for their carbon pollution, but they can also credibly report on quantified, verified progress towards SDGs. So we see opportunities to create a benchmark in the voluntary carbon market for high impact, community-based projects that have deep development profiles. And this can certainly help distinguish them in the market as the interest among financiers for greater liquidity risks over commodification, where high cost but also high value cook stove projects are in a basket with large industrial projects. The second opportunity is to engage the host governments to better leverage Article 6 for clean cooking. So the developing country governments can specify and prioritize certain sectors or activity types in their NDCs to make them suited for the cooperative approaches under Article 6. So this will be enabled. This will enable developed countries that are still considering market-based mechanisms or market-based approaches to meet their NDCs to simultaneously contribute to development priorities of the partner governments or the host country. So the host governments could go further and signal willingness to sign, for example, letters of authorization and assurance that can help expedite the project development and verification process. And I have to stress the importance that this will have to be coupled and supported by capacity building for the policymakers, implementation agencies, and project developers in those countries. And finally, we can seek more opportunities for aggregation through sustainable finance. So project level approaches have been able to mobilize carbon finance through the various carbon market mechanisms for clean cooking in many communities around the world. But transaction costs and relative complexity to reach the certainty needed to issue a carbon credit or carbon credits remains a barrier to scaling at the pace we need to meet our shared goal, the universal access to clean cooking by 2030. So there's a huge potential in portfolio level approaches that pull private investors looking to support transformative climate action to support the clean cooking sector. So there are case studies showing this potential, for example, in the livelihood funds, which is supported by a number of companies, including Danone, SAP, Chanel, and others. So these revolving funds can help enable clean cooking deployment while also enabling corporate investors to claim the impact toward their corporate climate targets. And again, report contributions towards the broader development agenda. So to conclude, if we're serious about climate justice, investment in clean cooking should accelerate as a matter of priority. So for our part, Gold Standard is committed to helping to catalyze climate finance for clean cooking and household energy to accelerate progress not only towards Paris Agreement and aligning with science, but to make meaningful contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. And it really struck me when you talked about the economic value of cook stove programs, high value cook stove programs and home biogas programs for every ton averted. $267 and $465 a piece is not insignificant and really shows that this is a good investment and so important in helping us reach net zero by 2050. Next up, I would like to pass it over to our moderator to moderate our panel session. The session will demonstrate the importance of clean cooking, heating, and lighting for achieving the world's climate as well as health goals. To reach net zero emissions by 2050 and limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, clean house energy must play a central role. And so we'll be speaking to some experts in the field and leaders really about how, what roles donors, practitioners, everybody has to play. So moderating this panel session is Adair Rohani. She's the technical lead for health and energy at WHO. Heather, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Donnie, and thank you all for the keynote speakers, Ms. Pachuri and Ms. Kim, fantastic presentations. And I have the honor and privilege to introduce some distinguished panelists that are joining us today to discuss the synergies between climate change, health, and clean cooking. Our first panelist will be Sandra Cavallari. She is the health coordinator of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which is hosted by the United Nations Environmental Program. We also have Ms. Asma Jibril, the Chief Science Officer of the Federal Ministry of Environment in Nigeria. We also are joined with Mr. John Mitchell, who works for the United States Environmental Protection Agency on clean cooking. And then we have Ms. Pallavi Pan Dr. Pallavi Pan from the Senior Scientist at the Health Effects Institute in Boston. So I would kindly actually ask all panelists to turn their video on. I really hope that this panel can be a very kind of interactive discussion. So please, all panelists, feel free to jump in if you have some additional comments or response. I'll start the question directing to a particular panelist, but if you have additional comments, please jump in as you feel. So I'd like to first start with Sandra. So as our panelists had just mentioned, they provided a lot of background on climate change and its climate impacts, as well as some opportunity for financing. So the Climate and Clean Air Coalition has really prioritized black carbon, addressing black carbon and methane protect climate, but it also protects health. So can you tell me how is it the Climate and Clean Air Coalition is really prioritizing household energy, not only to mitigate climate change, but also to protect health? And what are some of the regional projects or programs that you're working on? Over to you, Sandra.
So thanks so much, Heather. And yeah, it's a really big pleasure to be here today. I really enjoyed both of the keynote talks. And I think to take a step back, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition is working to reduce short-lived climate pollutants. So these are pollutants that live in the atmosphere for a short period of time. And black carbon, as Dr. Pachauri already gave an extensive overview, is a short-lived climate pollutant that lives in the atmosphere for a few days to a few weeks and really has regional impacts on the climate, both in terms of changing monsoon patterns as well as accelerating the melting of ice in the cryosphere regions. And so you have these regional climate impacts, but you also have health impacts from black carbon. So black carbon is produced during incomplete combustion and is a part of fine particulate matter, so PM 2.5, which is the fine particle that we breathe in and gets into our lungs, our hearts, our brains, and causes all litany of non-communicable health disease like stroke, heart disease, also can trigger asthma and is related to childhood development issues with cognitive ability. So this is really like a piece of the puzzle that is impacting both our climate and increasing warming and accelerating the impacts, but also our health and also agricultural crop production, because when black carbon lands on on plants, it's increasing the temperature and reducing the light intensity, which is limiting photosynthesis. So it's when we talk about multiple benefits, you know, as Margaret was doing with the SDGs, we really see that with these short-lived climate pollutants, if we reduce them, we have immediate benefit because they leave the atmosphere quickly. And we see these benefits for the local population, for the climate, and also for agriculture.
Great, thank you. Definitely sounds there are just a plenitude of benefits that can really be harvested or attained when we're addressing household energy and the climate impacts. And I'd actually, from that, I'd like to turn to Pallavi. Ms. Khan, if you could provide us some more information about how is it that the health is impacted from household energy use as well as climate, and particularly in low and middle income countries. Can you provide a little more details on that?
Yes, thank you so much, Heather. Really glad to be here. And, you know, in some ways, feel hopeful, especially with Margaret's comments just now about more finance going into the clean cooking sector, because at this time, especially in low and middle income countries, we still have millions of people not only getting exposed to air pollution, but also dying as a result of these exposures. And we normally tend to think, you know, a lot about our future generations. And what's happening in case of household air pollution is that the children, all the way from, you know, when they're born as infants to, you know, toddlers, and as they grow up, are experiencing these very high levels of exposures because we are continuing to use fuels that result in high levels of air pollution. And that means that not only are we seeing these impacts today in terms of deaths, but we are also impacting the next generation of people who are going to come. And over the years, there's been a lot of research looking specifically at how use of different types of household fuels can impact health. And Sandra already gave a bit of an introduction. And I think, you know, research that is growing, especially in low and middle income countries, because for the most part, in high income countries, you know, clean energy or at least LPG electricity access is available to people. So we don't see such a big impact. But in many countries, especially if we look at Asian countries and countries in sub-Saharan Africa, a significant proportion of the air pollution impacts are still coming from household air pollution. And most often, you know, we think of household air pollution as something that we're getting exposed to on a day-to-day basis. The other side of the story is that this air pollution being generated indoors isn't just staying in our homes, it's also going out. So actually, in reality, what we have is a situation where we're getting exposed to this pollution in our homes, and at the same time, it's going out and impacting what the outdoor air pollution levels are and how people get exposed to that, and, you know, resulting in health impact. So it's an issue that I think could be tackled in multiple different ways, has huge health burden, not just for, you know, the adults, but in particular for the children and the newborns. In low and middle income countries, especially in parts of Asia and Africa, where almost 80% of all deaths in infants can be because of these household exposures. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you. No, you provided the gravity of the situation and the impacts, and you made highlighted a good point about this contribution to the outdoor environment, right? So this really basically illustrates how the household air pollution is affecting the entire population, right? It's not just those people within the house, but it's actually affecting the entire community. So we all really should be taking action. And I would like to actually turn to Mr. Abril now to ask how in Nigeria, what are some plans and how are they prioritizing household energy access to address climate change, but also improve livelihoods and gender and health? Over to you, Mr. Abril.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Asmao from Nigeria. I'm a Chief Scientific Officer and work with the Federal Ministry of Environment. So Nigeria is focusing on increasing access to both LPG and improved biomass cook stoves to provide a bridge to a carbon neutral cooking future where electricity and renewable energy will meet the nation's cooking energy needs in the long term. And earlier this month, Nigeria held a 2-day Clean Cooking Forum to bring together key policymakers, private sector leaders, foundations, and research institutes, women groups, and civil society stakeholders, as well as other international partners to discuss the implementation plan towards achieving the clean cooking targets in the NDC. So we took a stock of current status of the clean cooking activities in the country and reviewed existing policies and practices that relate to clean cooking in Nigeria. As an outcome of this meeting, we had some steps to take, which include, of course, to have a seamless implementation of the NDCs. And we also are starting a process of having a single clean cooking policy. And of course, we need to work in harmony with the private sector, NGOs, and all the other key stakeholders in clean cooking. But in general, health benefits have been a primary driver for action, and we see opportunities to connect more closely with climate benefits through the NDCs and hopefully also through the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And we also did develop a national action plan to reduce
There's a bit of a connection issue. So they were talking about the national action plan. So I think she's integrated, Nigeria has integrated clean cooking into that. We'll see if she comes back. Okay, well, while we're waiting for her to reconnect, I'd like to actually follow on to John Mitchell from the USEPA. What are some ways that countries can really, how can governments prioritize this, and what is something the U.S. government is to support countries like Nigeria who have already committed to clean cooking to address their climate and health challenges that they have? So over to you, John.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, folks at the World Health Organization and the Clean Cooking Alliance for hosting us today. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say I'm on the edge of my seat with this cliffhanger. I want to know about the Nigerian action plan, but I'll jump in and say that the US government is re-engaging on household energy. We were a leader for some number of years. And we're pleased to be back working with all of you and partners throughout the world to achieve our common goal of universal access. So the US government's taking a whole of government approach with many agencies engaged in all doing what they do best, from research in the lab at EPA or in the field with NIH and CDC to implementation. We really believe that like any major challenge, we need to work in partnership. No one country or organization is going to address this issue. We've all been working on this issue for many years, decades even. And that's why I have to say I'm encouraged by what I heard from Margaret earlier because I think that moral suasion simply has not worked. Talking about 4 million people dying prematurely every year somehow is not enough to engage the world to address this. So I really think focusing below the headline on things, on cost benefit analysis, on the costs that household energy emissions are actually taking place now. We've talked about climate, CO2, 2% of all annual CO2 emissions are from household energy. It's the same as aviation or shipping. So we should get the same type of funding that aviation and shipping gets to reduce their emissions. We've talked about health, but it's not just people dying prematurely, but it's the burden on the government health every year. And it's also the burden on GNP, if you will, with people being sick and unable to go to work. So I think if we talk about the costs in different ways, I think it will grab the attention of country governments and around the world and the international community to work more closely together to address these multiple impacts.
Thanks, John. No, I think this is good. And it's great to see that the government, the U.S. government, is really pushing this forward. And indeed, I think that raising these impacts, and it's great to see with the gold standard to really account for more of these other benefits, and that's where we can really drive. I'd like to go back to Asma. I'm sorry we lost your connection for a moment. We're really eager to hear about the national action plans that you're having in Nigeria. Could you come back and tell us a little bit more about what that entails? Asma?
Sorry, Heather, my internet isn't cooperating, but I was just trying to say that we held a 2-day Clean Cooking Forum earlier this month, where we brought together the policymakers, for private sector leaders, research institutes, women groups, and the civil society partners to discuss the implementation plan towards achieving the clean cooking targets in the NDC. And we took stock of current status of clean cooking activities in the country and reviewed existing policies and practices that relate to the clean cooking. And as an outcome of the meeting, we intend to start the process of having a single policy on clean cooking, which we never had, because we have different policies, clean cooking included in different policies in different ministries and other organizations. So we do intend to have one single clean cooking policy under the Ministry of Environment. And we are working in harmony with the private sector and other key stakeholders to develop that. In general, health benefits have been a primary driver for action, and we see opportunities to connect more closely with climate benefits through the NDCs and hopefully also through Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Asma. That's very interesting. That I think the private sector is something I think that we often have a challenge in trying to engage them. It would be very. Could you elaborate a little more on how Nigeria's what their plans for engagement with the private sector are to accelerate this? Because I think this is something the community is really looking for examples, and it would be great to hear what plans are, because I know this can be a bit of a challenge. Asma, over to you.
Yes, it is, but we're setting up a subcommittee. We have an interministerial committee on climate change. So we are now intending to have a subcommittee under that platform on clean cooking. So apart from the ministries, the government organizations in the subcommittee, for the first time, we're including the private sector in it. We're having the clean cooking manufacturers in it, and the sellers and all those private sector included in clean cooking. So this is how we intend to bring them in, and they will also have a say, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that actually reach the grassroots at the local governments level and at the rural level. So we can see that they help the government in reaching out and having access to those rural and the grassroots. So that is why we see it as very important to bring the private sector in. And at the end of the day, they are the businessmen and women who actually deal with these clean cook stoves. And then they are the marketers as well. So that is how and why we want them into our activities on clean cooking.
No, I think that's a very interesting and it's integrated approach. I think that you really get engaging all the stakeholders in the value chain, which is maybe a great way to move forward. And it'd be great to see how this develops. And it's really excited. It's great to hear that you're reconciling all the different policymakers to have this one policy, because I think this is something we've seen in our various work, that there's often people working in parallel or sometimes in contradiction around household energy in a country. So that having something harmonized in the approach, it really will, I think, add value and help accelerate the achievements that we'd like to see. So I'd like to now turn the discussion back. Let's hear a little bit more from Sandra. Sandra, could you tell us a little about some of the CCAC projects you have on household energy and to reduce black carbon emissions and improve health?
Yeah, so we have supported over the years a lot of the interventions of the Clean Cooking Alliance, which I think has also helped us to all come to the same page. So over the years, we've supported the development of the ISO standards and also standards and labeling in countries, doing pilots in countries, including Nigeria and Ghana and some other countries. And we've also worked on the development of, or to fund the work of the Black Carbon methodology that the gold standard is the gold standard and included in the World Bank methodology on how to calculate the health and climate and gender benefits. And now we're working with the Clean Cooking Alliance and Berkeley Air on developing an MRV framework to help a measuring, reporting, and verification framework to help establish the baseline and then calculate the benefits so that targets can be met from the commitments and the conditional and non-conditional pieces of the NDCs, but also looking forward to Article 6 so that there is a harmonized approach in calculating these benefits so that we can help really drive this market investment and also collaboration among countries to figure out how we can achieve these multiple benefits in this framework that we have. And then just lastly, I would say the priority for the CCAC right now is really to leverage the power of our partnership. We have over 70 countries that are members of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition who are working to reduce short-lived climate pollutants. And I think that, this first thing that's needed that Shonali mentioned, that we need the political commitment. I think that's something that the Climate and Clean Air Coalition can help show, that there is political commitment and help provide platforms for countries to create even louder voices about the national priorities, because it's from the countries that I think the international community will listen and move more quickly. So that's our work right now.
Great, Sandra. No, this is great, and I think this all has to be country driven, right? We can't come in as international community. We need them. There needs to be buy-in. They need it's to be driven by themselves, right? We can provide support. So this is great that the CCA is moving that way. You mentioned something interesting about standards, and I'd like to actually turn to John on this. And how can cook stove standards help in understanding the climate change impacts of household energy and help reduce those? And what is some of the work the US EPA has done, perhaps with the Clean Cooking Alliance and WHO, in regard to standards development and working with countries to support them in this regard?
Thanks, Heather. So it's obvious that we need standards on how to test cook stoves. We need to know how they work. We need to know what differentiate. What is a good stove? What's a better stove? What is the best stove? So that both for policymakers, but also for consumers to understand what's in the market and how best to use their limited funds to buy a stove. So working with experts from around the world, the ISO standards on how to test stoves in the lab and also how to test stoves in the field were developed, which is a wonderful step forward. But that's all we have are those protocols. So the next step is to actually get countries to either adopt those standards or adapt them to their local conditions, and then implement those standards. So EPA has been working very closely with the Clean Cooking Alliance, the World Health Organization, and partners, GIZ and SNV, on the ground to identify people, to bring them together. We have held regional workshops in Nepal for Asia, in Kampala for East Africa, virtually last year because of the pandemic for West Africa, Francophone countries. And now we're working in Latin America. Again, the idea is to disseminate these standards, to have countries adopt them and to implement them. And well, where does that get us? And so, we've talked a lot about monitoring, reporting, and verification. We need to know how stoves that are currently in the market work. We need to know what the baseline is. So when countries have in their NDCs, they're going to reduce emissions, we need to know what the baseline is, and then we need to know how we're doing. And again, we do that through requiring that stoves be tested and that we learn what the emission reductions are. So standards are really the backbone in many ways of any program in any country. And with testing and getting to know how stoves work and how much better stoves are is really important if we're going to achieve our goals. Fortunately, through NDCs, through the work, through voluntary carbon reductions, monitoring, reporting, and verification are rigorous. And I think that will really add a lot of credibility to our sector as we go forward. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Don. No, that's great. And this is definitely an actionable item that countries can take forward to help really reduce their climate impact on household energy, as well as ensure health benefits by really implementing these standards. And that was a good way to also ensure, inform the consumer as well, to help them and stove designers. So I think this is a one way that we can really get actionable item that we can move forward. I'd like to again turn back to Pallavi. Pallavi, could you tell us a bit? We understand the standards and we understand emissions, but and broader, can you discuss how using source and sector air pollution data can better empower countries to incorporate household energy goals in their integrated energy planning and their climate targets and even health, perhaps, targets? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is an important question also because for a while now, we talk about climate and air quality co-benefits. And in some ways, the household energy sector is one place where there are multiple co-benefits, because through addressing this and providing access to clean energy, we're addressing climate, we're addressing air pollution. And as a result of that, we are also, improving public health. And some of the work that we have been doing and then funding others to do, looking at different sources of air pollution around the world and how they contribute to both the air quality and PM2.5 levels and also the health burden, is indicating very much in line with what other analyses have also shown, that the residential energy consumption, at the global scale is about 20%, of all PM2.5. And then when we start diving into individual countries, that percentage often goes up. And in many cases, again, as I was saying earlier, when we think about the issue of air quality management or mitigation in any country, we start with transport, we start with energy production, industry. And the residential sector isn't often the top line item that we're thinking about. So having these comprehensive data sets that can tell you the contribution of residential sources vis-a-vis industry, transportation, aviation, and those other pieces can be really helpful in finding the low-hanging fruit. One particular analysis from India that was published a couple of years ago, I believe, found that just through addressing household air pollution, India could actually meet its air quality standards. Now, these are the Indian air quality standards, which are a little bit higher than what the WHO guidelines are, but that's one sector and one intervention. Of course, it's difficult, it's, takes time, but if we think about the source in its own, addressing this could help us meet the Indian air quality standards. That's a very powerful, motivator for the governments to act. And then also placing the residential energy sources in the context of other contributions at the national and regional scales can be very helpful, because often our conversations on air quality are driven by urban issues and urban sources of air pollution. But this is a very pervasive source. It's present in many countries. So having this type of information can very clearly provide evidence to formulate policy or to accelerate policy that exists. And I think the other way that just sort of going back to what John was saying earlier about loss of productivity, healthcare costs. On the flip side, a positive of thinking about addressing household energy is also addressing social aspirations, because in most countries, people really want access to clean energy because that's like the next step that helps you lead a better life. So in addition to thinking about our climate and health co-benefits and air quality improvements, I think also bringing in that additional dimension of social aspirations and where people want to go can be a good motivator. So overall, information on the residential sector juxtaposed with how the other sectors contribute can really help with policy action and hopefully motivate others to join this, especially the private sector, financing, etc.
Great, no, I agree. And so having the sector is very powerful, because just that one sector, residential sector, could really help help India reach their local air quality levels. And that's a very powerful message. Another very powerful message, and it's of money, right? And you mentioned the loss, I think that, it's on the scale of trillions in terms of lost productivity, if I remember the most recent World Bank report estimating that. So I want to now open this panel up to everyone to speak and to chime in. One of the things that I want to talk about is specifically the funding. How can we ensure that more funding is available to countries that have prioritized clean household energy and their climate goals? We heard briefly from one of our keynote speakers, Kim, and that might be one way is using climate finance. But I'd like to hear from you all. What are some ways, and what can we drive this funding? Because the buck speaks. We all know money talks. So how can we get the necessary funds that we need? Because it's actually a very small amount that's needed investment to achieve universal clean cooking, if you were to compare that to the amount that we're spending on many other issues. So let's see, I will turn maybe to Asma first. Well, what do you think about funding? What can we do? How is funding serving, and what are some potential ways of finding that funding? Asma?
Thank you, Heather. I know funding is very important, especially for us in the developing world, because we need to really reach the population of our countries. And most of the population are using the biomass, the fuel, wood for cooking and heating. So I think we need a lot of funding to tackle this. We need to increase the capacity, both at the national level, but also in our states and local level governments. The federal government cannot do this alone. We do make the policies and try to see how this works, but of course we cannot do this alone. And we need stronger coordination with the energy sector so that we can help pilot and implement clean cooking solutions.
Thank you. No, it's great. And it requires all different actors in government to do this and prioritizing it. So let me turn to John. How do you think we can help countries get some funding and some sources? What are some ways that we can push this forward to tackle this issue?
Well, I think countries, even donor countries, have limited funding. They need to decide where they're going to spend that funding. And there are many reasons they decide. And one of them is where they're going to get the most sort of bang for their investment, right? So I think this circles back to what we've all been talking about, which is better monitoring and reporting, so that we can show that funding invested in household energy is going to get results. It's going to get results in emissions reductions for climate. It's going to get health impacts. So I think trying to prove that case will really help funding come to this sector. I think everybody needs to know that their money is well spent, right? So we really need to be making a business case because funding will flow to where those emissions reductions are easiest to get, and then work their way up the ladder. So I think for me, that's the first thing, is starting to become, and we're moving in that direction rapidly. And we've heard from almost every speaker has talked about this, about monitoring and verifying the impacts. And also, as Margaret mentioned, because this sector has multiple positive or negative impacts, this is a place where funding is likely to go. But we need to prove that 100 million euros is going to get X, Y, and Z. And as we do that, and we are doing that, but as we increasingly do that, I believe more funding will flow to this sector.
Thanks, John. And Sandra, how is the CCAC helping with the funding aspect and getting to accelerate this access to clean energy?
So I definitely think that one of the interesting things about the Climate and Clean Air Coalition is that from the beginning, when we launched the coalition in 2012, the real core idea was that these multiple benefits were sort of equal. So if you were a country that was coming to the table because you were primarily interested in health benefits for your population, and that's why you wanted to work on SLCPs, that was equally important to a country that was coming to the table for climate benefits and equally important for agricultural benefits. And so you really do see these priorities really almost equally represented at the table. And so I think that as we're working on methane, HFCs, and black carbon, and I think we can all see in the news and recognize that methane is taking a huge political importance right now. You have the US-EU Global Methane Pledge, and you have a big push coming towards COP. But this does not diminish the work of our work on black carbon and our work on HFCs. I think HFCs, a lot of countries consider kind of like, organized now with the Kigali Amendment, but we are not organized on black carbon. And I think it's really, my hope is that the countries who are sitting around the table for the health benefits and for the black carbon mitigation will help increase their voice to make it clear that this is kind of a joint effort, and we're not going to forget about these huge, tremendous benefits. And I think the countries have so much power through their ministries of finance, through their prioritization with the World Bank, through their prioritization through the multilateral development banks, and that this power needs to be unleashed like right away, because we want to achieve SDG 7 and clean energy access for all. And this is the power, to me, is in the countries. And I think it was, I can't remember if it was Margaret or Shonali who talked about like the moral imperative that we all share to help address this crisis. And like you said, Heather, this is really not a lot of money considering the money that's really flowing around. It's a lot, to me in my mind, but it's nothing as compared to what we're talking about, in other sectors. So, I think it's, that's the power of this, is in raising the awareness and making sure that we all have fairness around the world.
No, I agree entirely. I'd like to move to shift to another question. We talked about the funding. We know that's what's needed to take actions. And so now we have a few more minutes of the panel discussion before we open up questions to the audience. So I really would like everyone to tell me, what is the actions that we need to do first? What is the priority actions that we need to get household energy at COP26 in Glasgow? How can we make this, elevate this as an opportunity for climate, for health, for development? And Pallavi, let's start with you. Over to you, Pallavi. How can we elevate this clean household energy at COP26 and make action?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. I think, sort of building on what the other panelists were just talking about in terms of funding, identifying the right data and the right and compelling messages that can help draw people's attention to the issue, but also bring together the varied arguments that we've had over the years on why we need to address household energy could be the ideal place to start, because we have lots of good information, lots of good data and evidence that backs the claims that we're trying to make here, that addressing this problem is going to lead to multiple solutions, multiple benefits. And in addition to that, if we could highlight the positive success stories, because that's what people love to see, what worked in a place. And I think in case of household energy, even though we still have a long way to go, there have been success stories along the way that have shown us that this can be done if we, get behind it, if we have the right resources allocated to it. So combining the messages and aligning the sort of stories between the different sectors that are all saying the same thing, but maybe not with the same voice and in the same platform, and then finding the right positive success stories to say, here's how it was done, and we want to do it in other places, could be a great place for us to begin.
Great. So we have data, we have success stories. Those are some great things to push for. Let's turn to Asma. What do you think? What are some specific actions that we need to put forward to drive this and make impacts on clean household energy at COP26 in Glasgow? What is the role? How can we push it? What are some actions?
So we need to increase demand among the 70% of households that are reliant on traditional cook stoves and use firewood as their primary fuel. But the path to progress really needs to focus on addressing the cooking energy poverty across Nigeria. I'm talking about Nigeria now. And for this, we really need government policies and significant financial support from development banks and other mechanisms. But I think we need to continue to be sure to raise the profile of household energy so it is prioritized among solutions. And we cannot achieve the SDGs without clean household energy, and we cannot achieve the 1.5 degrees without clean household energy. We need more funding and more global effort to tackle the crisis, which affects 2.8 billion people who do not have access to clean cooking fuels and technologies worldwide. So this we have to prioritize at the COP26, and we have to be heard on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so we really need to connect our politicians to these stories and also get the people themselves aware and understanding. So over to John. What would you say is the actions that we need to put household energy in the COP26?
Well, I think our entire community needs to speak loudly and clearly and often about the contribution of household energy to climate. And yes, we've talked a lot about the co-benefits, but this is a climate conference, and I think we need to focus on climate and say, we demand a seat at the table. At 2% of the global climate emissions for CO2, this needs to be one of those issues that is addressed. And I think, I think we also have an opportunity. Pallavi said, to be positive, and I think the positive piece of this is through NDCs, governments are now offered the opportunity, and I think really for the first time, to say, you know what, this is a priority for us. This is what we're going to be working on to reduce our emissions. And then that will enable other country governments to join hands with them to help them achieve these goals. But I think we just need to be loud and clear and say, hey, this is a large sector, 2%, we need to be part of the solution, and let's figure out how to make that happen.
Couldn't agree more. I think, yes, 2% is a significant amount, and we have these clean cooking compacts that have come out of the high-level dialogue of energy, and we'd like to see more of them, because that's, again, this commitment, and this is something, actions and commitments already put forward by countries to put this forward. So let's all chime in, and let's be loud and clear, agreed, for all our audiences. And not last but not least, Sandra, what would be your priority action?
So I just wanted to jump in on what John said, because I really love this. This like this idea that you know, household energy is a part of the climate solution, but I also think we could flip it around and say you can't do climate without doing household energy. So if you think you're working on the climate and you're not working on household energy, you're not working on climate. And just like, I just feel like tweaking it just a tiny bit makes people understand that yes, you can have huge emissions reductions that are easy to get, and maybe it's a more complicated system when you involve people in households and state government and national government, but it is simply not an option not to work on this issue.
No, I like that spinning of the argument, and I think that that's definitely a way to go. So I think we have some questions from the audience, if that's okay, that I'll prepare the panelists now. We'll shift, if that's okay. One question that we've seen is, this is probably best place for John, as we discussed a bit earlier, and you've held several workshops and standards. So what is the relationship actually between the ISO standards and WHO air quality guidelines, and how does that actually also perhaps link to climate change? But mainly, what is the connection between ISO standards and WHO air quality guidelines?
Great question, because I think one of the best things that came out of our work on the standards is the voluntary performance targets. And that's basically is, okay, you've tested the stove. Now, how do you rank it? What is the report card you're using? And so we have tiers of performance from 0 to 5 for a number of categories. And one of them is linked with the WHO guidelines. And of course, over time, we'll need to update that as the guidelines have changed, because we want to make sure that if a stove is rated as a tier 5 stove, that it is actually healthy and not just better performing than tier 4 or tier 3. So they are linked together, and the voluntary performance targets is basically how you report on how a stove performs in the laboratory.
Thank you. Wonderful. My next question is for Asmat. So in Asmat, in Nigeria, is there experience results-based finance in Nigeria? And is that climate related or not? So have you been working with some results-based financing for clean cooking in Nigeria?
Thank you. Yes, there's some experience on that because the federal government once gave funding for clean cooking stoves to be distributed, which were purchased and were later distributed amongst the 6 geopolitical zones. And these were taken into the communities and were distributed free. But another thing is the manufacturers do not, that is, the manufacturers are from the private sector, do not really want this distributions of clean cook stoves free, because that kills their market. But notwithstanding, we tried to do that. That is just a pilot to introduce this clean cooking stoves to the rural community, and for them to understand the importance of using this clean cooking stoves. So yes, they are climate related, because it was done so as to show that this is done to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and the short-lived climate pollutants, which of course will help with co-benefits of health. And this was raised, the awareness was raised among these rural communities, and it was quite acceptable.
So results-based financing is definitely being used in it more and more, and it's good to see that Nigeria is trying out. And it is something that's a bit complicated, but it requires the monitoring, and that's something I'd like to also put forward to all the panelists is how we can better track. We've heard the alluded to the multi-tier tracking framework, Shinami, as well as some of the work that the ASA is doing in better tracking household energy use. We at WHO as well, we're doing it. So we're really trying to better understand our monitoring impact and how can we use our better understanding and better tracking of information to help help the climate argument, help us quantify these benefits and help drive policymakers to really appreciate this impact. So Pallavi, what do you think about tracking and monitoring? How can we use this a bit more to enhance the climate change? And I see Shanali also popped in, so she's also welcome to comment on this. So we'll start with Pallavi and then we can hand it over to Shanali. Over to you, Pallavi.
Thanks, Heather. I think this is a really important question. And again, I think several organizations are thinking about the best ways to do this at very local scales, because sometimes that's where the changes are happening at a very rapid pace, and then also nationally. And then we hear this over and over again, but one good systematic comparable program that could be implemented in multiple countries would really help us. And the key here would be to ensure that countries where these actions are being undertaken are really front and center. So making sure that any kind of tracking programs take into account what resources are available, how easy it would be to do a certain setting or not. In recent years, we've seen, a number of advances, even in terms of the devices and types of data that can be utilized for tracking specific stove use or figuring out, how much fuel is being consumed. So ensuring that the needs or, interests of the communities that are the sort of places where we want to do the monitoring, and also especially in countries where resources may be limited, priorities may be many, making sure that the tracking systems are targeted and as, less burdensome as possible to make sure we're actually able to keep up with it, and then ensuring that the information becomes available in open access databases so that others can think of more creative solutions over time. I think that would be reasonable to begin with, but I think Shanali might have some good ideas on this.
Shanali, over to you to compliment Pallavi Johnson.
Yeah, thanks very much, Heather. So, this is a topic that's dear to my heart, so I had to chime in. I think there's so much that can be done, and it is happening slowly, but it just needs to be happening at a much faster pace than it has been so far. So, there are so many existing surveys that take place. We have the Living Standard Measurement Surveys, we have the DHS surveys, we have the mixed surveys, and all of these do ask some questions regarding cooking practices, cooking stoves, and so on. And I know doing surveys is extremely expensive, but even here the technology is evolving. There's so much digitalization that can really make this much cheaper today. So, I think there's really a huge potential there to kind of standardize a limited set of questions that really help us get at some of these broader impacts of transitioning to clean cooking. And then in addition to, of course, existing surveys and so on, I think there are so many sources of information that one can tap into. I'm just taking one example here, for instance, with the LPG program in India. For instance, we realized that actually the oil companies, the LPG distributors, they have a mine of data on the sales of their LPG, right? And this is information that they keep private for most cases. But this kind of data could be made available to researchers. I know in some cases the companies consider this sensitive data and they don't want to share it, but at least to the research community, to the science community, this kind of data can be made available. And it's really a gold mine for trying to assess how regularly people are using LPG amongst those who have got the stoves, and whether we are seeing this transition to cleaner cooking, or there are barriers to really using it, whether that be affordability or reliability of supply or whatever else. And then of course there are also Earth observation data sets out there that I think can be tapped to also look at in areas where we would expect air quality to be improving significantly because of transition to clean cooking, whether that's really showing up in terms of the monitoring. So, I mean, I think there's a whole bunch that can be done. And I think this is an area that really requires a lot of additional efforts.
Thanks. No, agreed. And we've been, WHO's worked hard with the Clean Cooking Alliance, in fact, to really try to enhance the questions on national surveys, but there's still not necessarily as far as we need to go. And there are so many options available. I'd like to ask, would Sana or Sandra or John, would you like to comment or anything else in regard to the tracking? Go ahead, Sandra, over to you.
I just want to say, this just popped into my mind, but I think it's a really interesting thing to think about the collaboration of the private sector with the research community. We had a lot of success doing that with oil and gas companies on methane, and that's why we now are going to have an international monitoring IMEO. I forget now exactly the acronym, but it's an international monitoring system that is like a voluntary system where also oil and gas companies, I think, are getting involved. We have the oil and gas methane partnership from the CCAC, and I think it's just a growing collaboration over time. And I just wonder if maybe there are some major household energy suppliers that would be interested in working together with the research community that could be coordinated through the UN. And so I just think that's something we should pick up on. I'm not sure, I actually don't know the answer to this question. Maybe someone could share, like, are there some sort of major suppliers, or are we really just, do we just really have like a huge number of suppliers? And I guess it depends on the fuel and the stove and all the rest of it. But I mean, would it pop into mind that, oh, there could be 5 companies we could start with?
I'll leave the other panelists to react. I think this is a good part. I do think that that would make a big shift in India was when they were really partnering with the actual petroleum companies themselves, and they brought them on board, really through the Ministry of Petroleum, I believe. So any ideas on how we might better get some specific partnerships between private sector and research communities and to put this forward?
Well, I think this is John. I think when we think about, countries and their NDCs, it's sort of like, I would imagine it gives them the incentive to engage the businesses within their country to see, what is the baseline now, how much LPG is being distributed, to how many customers, how frequently, and, in broad numbers, not the specific data that Shanali was mentioning that they don't want to release. So that a country can have a better handle on where they are today, and so where they want to go moving forward to engage these private sector partners with all the other actors to increase the use of clean or cleaner fuels and reduce the use of more polluting fuels.
We're wrapping up here, and I first of all just want to thank the panelists, because I definitely spiced things up a little bit and went a little bit out of order and a little off the record, just to make it a little more interesting, because I knew we had a bunch of experts here. And I would just like to give them all one last comment. If you have one last comment for us to really take home about COP and clean cooking and health and accelerating this access, what would you say? And yeah, one sentence. Sandra first. Over to you, Sandra.
Well, I think I'll just repeat what I said before, that if you're working on climate change, you're working on household energy, and we need to see exactly like what the plan is and what the progress is, and have this integrated approach.
Great. John, what would you say?
I say that I'm really heartened by the fact that we have these Paris climate plans, the NDCs, and that country governments really, for the first time, are taking ownership of the household energy issue. And that, I think, enables other governments to then work more easily with them in the international community, because a country is saying, this matters to us, right? We're working on this, please work with us together. And I think working in partnerships will enable us to achieve our respective goals.
Asma, over to you. What's the big one take-home message you need to bring to COP to address these issues?
Well, I'd like to say that investment is needed to achieve these targets and these multiple benefits for gender, for health, and for our environment. And we need to make these things affordable and accessible. Thank you.
Agree entirely. Investment is important. Lavi, over to you.
I think I'm going to repurpose what Sandra said, which was a very good sort of rally call that there cannot be, effective climate action without addressing household energy, because that sort of sums up everything that we're talking about here. So thank you, Sandra, for highlighting that for all of us.
And I'll leave the last. I agree, Sandra. We need to make a little, like, I don't know, a social media card or something with this. I think that's a fantastic way. Shonali, last one to you, and then I hand it over to Donnie to close things up. Shonali.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. So I also liked very much Sandra's rally cry, but I would say it's not only climate action, but it's sustainable development more broadly that has to be thought of as being not achievable without addressing household energy issues. So yeah, I completely agree.
Thanks. So thanks again to the panelists. It was an amazing discussion, and I really appreciate your time. And again, they were a little spicy. I threw in some crazy questions in there for them. So over to you, Donnie.
Thanks so much, Heather. And again, thanks to all the panelists and the keynotes, both Margaret and Shonali. Really engaging discussion today. And I think we should end it with what Sandra said. And I wrote it down. If you think you're working on climate and you aren't working on household energy, then you aren't working on climate. So let's end it with that. And thank you, everybody, for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.